Really appreciate this, Bev. Of course, this chat here is all about chatting with you about the historical content that you put in, which I thought was pretty fascinating. There were, you surely talked about some things about Stephen King that I'm not sure I even wanted to know about. Finishing up some writing sessions while sitting in his pool of his own blood before letting his wife, Tabitha, take him to the hospital. To how some of the publications themselves actually came about. What comes to your mind when I first ask you, or when I ask you rather, about your first experience reading Stephen King and when you were decidedly hooked for life on the work of King?
So I started reading King when I was in university. I grew up in a small town, small community, so I didn't really have access to a lot of resources. But when I went to university, I moved to a fairly big city, Halifax, Nova Scotia. And there was a really great used bookstore just down the street from campus that I used to frequent. And I was reading primarily science fiction and fantasy at the time. But I saw a copy of Salem's Lot on an end cap on a rack in the used bookstore, and I picked it up and added it to the pile of books I bought that day. And I was honestly I was hooked from that point on. It was such a great story, such great characters. And I've always had the trait that when I find something that I like, I immediately want to go and read everything else or buy every album by, somebody that I like. And so I started backtracking. And this was 1979, so there wasn't a lot to go back to. There was only a handful of books. So I went back and probably didn't read them in order, I don't think, but I went back to do, The Shining, The Stand, Carrie, Night Shift, and then probably sat there and waited for The Dead Zone to come out in paperback because it was still in hardcover and I was just a poor university student.
Did you go ahead and try to collect all the magazines as well? Or I guess at the time they were kind of questionable publications for a university student if you're trying to track down all of, I guess, Stephen King's short stories as well that would have been out.
A couple of years later,
various men's magazines.
Yeah, I sent a fan letter to King in about '82, and when he wrote back, there was in the envelope there was also a bibliography that had a list of all of his short story publications that hadn't been collected and interviews and things like that. And so those 2 sheets of paper stayed in my wallet for quite a while I haunted other used bookstores and tried to find, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction that had The Wedding Gig or some of the men's magazines, and eventually tracked them pretty much all down.
Very cool. And speaking of tracking down everything Stephen King as well, so I appreciate the segue. Considering all the books on King that you have, of course, published to date, you've got quite a few of them. When would you say that your interest in Stephen King gravitated from just being an ultimate King fan to a bona fide historian where you felt you needed to know absolutely everything there was to know about Stephen King, and then, of course, to put that into various collections to share those findings with the world?
I in the 80s and 90s, anytime I saw an interview or anything like that, I saved it. So I've got this file cabinet that was just full of old interviews and essays and things like that. So I've always sort of collected that sort of material. In about 2001, Richard Chizmar asked if I would be interested in writing a column for Cemetery Dance magazine. The magazine had always had an essay in every issue that was King news and reviews and commentary. And so I was happy to start with that. And that was really where I got my my toe dipped in the water about writing more seriously about King than just on the internet, on chat boards and news groups and things like that. And so I've been doing that for Cemetery Dance for over 20 years. And it was on the strength of that, really, that I was able to get a publishing contract for The Road to the Dark Tower when that came along.
I think that was your first big collection that you did publish, as far as the history of Stephen King, and really get
Yeah,
behind the scenes, I believe.
It was an analysis of the Dark Tower series. So it was sort of, I like to say that it's like a travel log, a tour guide's trip through Midworld to see all of the things that are in the Dark Tower books and the way they connect to all of his other books.
And I'm glad that you mentioned, of course, your introduction to Cemetery Dance as well, because I was really curious. I mean, how does that go about? I mean, I know that as you get chatting with Rich, he's all about the books. And do you remember how that came about when you and Rich first discussed his insane idea of reading every Stephen King book ever published, and how you kind of got on board as well with your own historical contributions of all things King?
Yeah, I'm not sure whose idea it was. Brian Freeman, who was sort of the managing editor of Cemetery Dance at the time, might have been the one who came up with the idea, or it might have come from Rich. Yeah, it was like very early in the process. I mean, I was on board right from the very beginning. And so, I mean, it's right in my wheelhouse. I had all sorts of material that I could dig into to give the books the context of, what was going on when the books were written. Because, it's fine to sort of, there's lots of contemporary interviews where people, King especially, looks back and says, well, this is what was happening. But memories change over the years. Carrie was, 50 years ago.
Right.
And what I'd like to do was to dig into things that were written at the time. And so I found the interviews that came out as close to publication date as possible to get the most accurate representation of where his inspiration came from, and how the book developed, and how it went into the publication pipeline, and then what his thoughts on it were immediately after or as soon thereafter as possible.
Right. Yeah. And I thought it added so much to Rich's own journey as well, because in a sense, on one end of it, of course, the reading aspect of it was very much Rich's journey of going back and rereading all the books and going along with him and seeing how his perspective might have changed, because life definitely changes. But I thought it was a pretty incredible contribution to the book as well, having you write about that. And it wasn't just a matter of you trying to remember, oh, I think this is what happened, I remember this part. It, like as you mentioned, it was literally going back almost in a bit of a time capsule. When Rich did find this idea, or maybe it was Brian Freeman, what did you think about that, about the idea of going through and rereading them all? I mean, you kind of had it easy when you first discovered Kane through Salem's Lot. Like, a whole lot. At this point, there's an overwhelming amount of King books. I mean, geez, just as this colossal mammoth books of, of course, of the Dark Towers, the Stand, and every other book in between that. I mean, what did you first think when Rich said, hey, this is what I'm going to do? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's cool. I think there was a point, and I couldn't tell you exactly when it was, but it might have been in the mid-90s, where I did this experiment myself. I went back and reread the books in order. Of course, Rich had a more daunting task because there were many more books by that point, because King keeps publishing one or two a year. But it's an interesting thing to reevaluate a book that you've read many years down the road, because there are some books that, for me, when I read them the first time, I thought, that's an interesting book, that's okay, it's a good story. And then something, there's something in your life that changes. You get older, you have more experience, and you go back and read that book again, and you just say, wow, this book is, I didn't really understand at the time how really powerful and how well conceived and executed a particular book was. So it's always interesting to have the before and after perspective, because we do read things through different lenses based on the experience that we have between the two time periods.
100%. I recall, I mean, I just finished rereading the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde about a few months ago, actually, and I think I first read that when I was 10 years old, I think it was one of the first horror books I read. And yeah, you're talking about perspective and the way they digest the books and what they mean to you is it's completely different. Like, and I think they're supposed to be different. You know, how could they not be? I suppose we've got so many different filters in your lens, and everything just completely changes. To kind of piggyback off of, you know, the changed lenses, do you find that you're able to look back and have a different perspective over what Stephen King might have gone through and some of his experiences from, say, 20, 30 years ago? Do you find that there's any new surprises now when you do kind of dig back through your catalog of history of King?
I think the one thing that always intrigues me, and I have a new book that came out last year. It was called Stephen King, A Complete Exploration of His Work, Life, and Influences. And the interesting thing for me, you know, the order of the words in that title, work, life, and influences, is, you know, the work comes first, but the things that were going on in his life sometimes percolate through into what he's working on. And so I was really always fascinated by the seed. What was the beginning idea that then grew into this novel, especially? And sometimes it's just a dream or a snapshot or a fleeting image or a transient thought that then sort of, it's like the grain of sand in the oyster. The oyster worries away at it and keeps adding layers to it, and then eventually you've got the complete story at the end. And sometimes you can go back and say, yes, I can see the straight line from that initial snapshot to the final thing. And then there's other times where the snapshot either doesn't even figure into the final work, or it's, you know, you would never have thought, how did you get here from there? And so that sort of creative trajectory is one thing that I've really been fascinated at going back and rediscovering.
Yeah, and I find it's really fascinating too, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this as far as, I mean, I don't know if you can go through the years and necessarily, I guess, categorize Kane as this was this particular phase and this particular phase. What I find interesting when you look at the socials is a lot of folks will say, oh, I read Stephen King, you know, way back in the day, 30 years ago, and he wasn't really my cup of tea, but I keep hearing everything about him, which is hard to get away from because, I mean, you know, George R. R. Martin, in his famous quote, I think, put it best, where it's like, you know, how the F do you write so many damn books all the time? Every time you turn around, there's a new Stephen King book. And I know this is a really, and it seems like it's a lazy question to ask, but I'm not really sure it's fair to ask a specific question because I don't think there's a specific answer. But what is your thoughts on that when you read the book, say for, you know, the last 5 years of Stephen King now versus even 5 years before that when he was doing the Mr. Mercedes? Do you reading itself has really changed, or do you think it's very much just in tune with maybe what Stephen King is going through with his own life and his changing lens?
Well, you know, people look at the Mercedes books and the sort of related crime books, the ones he did for hard case crime, to say that he's, you know, changed direction. But if you go back to his early works, you know, a lot of the earliest short stories that he published, even before Carrie, there was a lot of crime fiction in there. There were stories like The Fifth Quarter and The Wedding Gig and The Ledge. You know, some of them have scary elements to them, but there's no supernatural elements to them. They're straight up crime stuff. And knowing King as I do in terms of the sorts of things he likes to read and the things that he likes to watch, I mean, crime fiction has always been a big part of what he consumes. He's always been big on people like Donald Westlake and, you know, all of the great crime novelists over the years. That's been part of his jam. I mean, one of the challenges I had when I did the new book was, you know, how do you divide up the eras in his life? And for me, the answer that seemed the easiest, but there was some logic to it, was by decade, because in the 1970s that was sort of his Doubleday, you know, era. You know, he changed publishers at the end of that, but that was the time when he was, you know, finding his feet, when he was publishing some really great books, but he was still, heavily under the influence of his editor, being forced to change things for purely economic reasons. And then he shifts to Viking in the 79 era. And then we have this 80s era where he's just on fire. I mean, everything that he publishes becomes a bestseller at that point. And he's just cruising through. But he's also suffering from various sorts of addictions, which are fueling, his energy process in one way or another. And then, you reach the end of the 80s and you get the point where he goes into, recovery. He essentially empties the slate. He publishes 4 books in a matter of like 16 months and says, okay, this is the stuff that came before, and now we're going to change gears a little bit. We go into the 90s, and it's sort of a period of experimentation. He does 3 books in a very short period that are told from the perspective of a female protagonist. And, he's doing some interesting things with the early facets of the internet. Umni's Last Case, the short story, was the first one that he ever published as an ebook. And so he was seeing, what are the possibilities there? And then we reached the end of the 90s, and of course there's his accident, which is a real defining point in his career. Everything that comes beyond that is heavily influenced by the repercussions of that. Plus, he moves publishers again, and he starts getting more critical appreciation, starting with books like Bag of Bones, and certainly On Writing is a book which even people who don't generally read King have cited as being a very important work for writers. And so then we go through the early 2000s.
100%.
We've got the Dark Tower era where he finishes things off. And then, we get into the 2010s when, he really embraces his crime fiction roots, but also takes, the thing I've always noticed about the 2 different series, the Mercedes books and the Hard Case crime books, is the first one in the trilogy starts out to be pretty much straight crime. The second one is a little bit more supernatural influence, and then the third one is full on, Stephen King horror, supernatural. It's no longer like a mainstream crime. So yeah, that's the way I was thinking about the way that you could sort of segment in one way his career.
I suppose the $1 million question that you get asked the most, which maybe it changes year to year with Stephen King, and I'm sure you already know my question, is of all the books you've ever read of Stephen King, and I'll assume you probably read them all, what would you say is the one that you remember most fondly as far as overall reading experience? Maybe even the one that you go back to the most often, either in your head or physically with an interview.
Yeah, I mean, I have been asked that before, and you're right. My answer does sort of vary. I mean, it's easy to go back to Salem's Lot because there was a magical experience of discovery when reading that book, and I have gone back and reread it a number of times. I do have to say that the experience of reading the last 3 Dark Tower books, and maybe not everybody knows, but King gave me the manuscripts to those last 3 books about 2 years before they were published, so that I could work on The Road to the Dark Tower and have it ready for publication at the same time as the 7th book came out. And so I had this experience of sitting on the couch with this stack 2,500 pages of manuscript, just, take one page off the stack and read it and move it to the other one, and just, being the only person who was experiencing the books at that time. That was sort of the
best secret in town.
Yeah.
Now, because of that experience, would those be the books that you would probably be more apt to recommend to somebody that's, maybe it's new on board, or they're, I've heard the Stephen King guy can write okay. What should I start with?
I often go to Bag of Bones because it is a literary romantic ghost story horror novel. So it's got a lot going on that I think might appeal to people who maybe aren't into full-on horror. It certainly has its horrific elements, but it's really a love story with a ghost. Actually, it's a special kind of ghost. It's a ghost that's possessed. So, there's a lot going on in that. On the other hand, I'm not sure that I would recommend Revival as the opening gambit, because it's one of the, even though, it's not until the very end that you realize how bleak and terrifying the book is. But by the time you get to the end, it is just one of the most horrific things that he's ever written. The Dark Tower is sometimes a difficult
I agree, 100%.
For a lot of his readers. I mean, even people who've read him regularly have sometimes had a hard time getting into that series. Although I have to say, I've probably read it.
Yeah,
I don't know how many times, 10 times or more. Lisi's story, to me, is a bookend to Bag of Bones. Those two go together very well. The first one is the story of a writer who loses his wife, and the second one is the story of the wife of a writer who loses her husband. And there's a nice symmetry to that pairing.
And I guess if I may ask you one, and I really, really appreciate your time today, Bev. This has been, I knew this would be fascinating, but I didn't know how fast it was. It's super awesome to actually get a guy like yourself that's literally followed King from, I guess, really the virtual beginning of his career. And you've got some incredible insights. So it's been really cool to get your interpretation of his work. Sort of reach for the cherry, I guess, on this chat, and maybe the cherry of your collection is that of all the King books that you have, what would you say is the most cherished one that, God forbid, the house catches on fire, and besides, your living, breathing loved ones, what's the first thing that you're grabbing out of that King collection and running out the door with?
So I have a little yellow legal tablet, one of the small ones, and on it, its pages is handwritten the section of Song of Susanna where Roland and Eddie first meet Stephen King. And King wrote it on an airplane while he was flying out to California to visit Frank Muller, who was an audiobook narrator who was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident. And Muller had done the audiobooks of some of the Dark Tower books, plus many other of King's. And King sent me that tablet as a gift one time, and that's really my prized possession.
Wow. Yeah, notice that that obviously is not going to change. You wasted no time at all grabbing that time running for it. So that's incredible. No, sorry, did you say a tablet? Are you referring to an electronic device with the ones?
No, just a little, like this. Just a bunch of pages, and it was handwritten.
Okay, that's incredible. Yeah, that's literally one of a kind, then, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's
and what's interesting is on the front page of it, he has his list of things that he wanted to remember to take with him. And, it's the regular stuff, but then there was some funny things he put on there, like nightmare repellent and, a few little things like that.
Nightmare repellent. I'm not sure his fans, if that's the one thing he forgot, that I'm pretty sure his fans are like, right, don't worry about that one. bring on the nightmares. We don't want you to repel them. Although I'm sure he's repelled a few of them by having people face them and, get that cathartically out of their system, I'm sure. So that's fantastic. And what do you think what can we expect for the next volume? Maybe this is a better question to ask for Rich, but I assume that the next volume of Stephen King Revisited, that's already your contribution, I assume, is already kind of locked and loaded, or is that still in a work in progress?
Well, it's been a good number of years since Rich did his last entry in that. So it's online. It started at, at stephenkинgrevisited.com. And so he would do his essay. Yeah. Usually I had my historical context essay ready before, and sometimes, Brian would publish that first while we waited to get Rich's contribution. But it's been a good number of years since Rich has continued the saga. I have about 6 essays on the dashboard of that website ready to go for the next 6 books. And so if and when you do have Rich face-to-face on the camera, maybe you can ask him when he's going to pick that up again. But there's been a lot going on in Rich's life. You know, he's
100%.
He's done the Gwendy books with King. He's published his first novel, which has done extremely well, and I know he's got a sequel to it coming along. So, you know, plus running a publishing business.
Right.
But every now and then, however subtly or not so subtly, I can egg him on to see, you know, when you're going to do the next one, because I'm ready to go when you are.
Perfect. So I'll ask him that. So I said, not that Bev wants to pass you, or I want to pass you, but come on, Rich, let's get it together now. When's it coming out? Perfect. Yeah, I'm actually chatting with him in a couple of days, so I'll be sure to slap that in there.
Yeah,
so I'll do that at the end.
Just tell him Bev's ready to go.
Get to it.
I'll tell him Bev's ready to go for the next 6 books.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Bev. So I'll be sure to link down here for revisited.com so that, you know, we can get everybody else knocking on that door as well and saying, when's the next one, Rich? And I'll, of course, put a link down there to the road to the Dark Tower as well. It's a pretty fascinating journey. So I'll make sure that people are aware of that. I can't thank you enough for the time today. So much appreciated. This has been awesome. Thanks so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video as much as I hope you did, please consider hitting the like button so that this could reach out to more people like yourselves. Really appreciate that. And if you want to keep in touch with the channel, please also consider subscribing and hitting that notification button. Thanks so much. We'll see you on the next one. And while you're waiting for the next one, why not check out this video? Because that's the one that YouTube thinks that you're going to like next. Have a great day. Stay dark, stay well, stay hungry.